Good morning, everyone. This is Penny from Wisconsin Land and Water, and welcome to our webinar today. It's going to be working with small organic farming operations, and we have two presenters, and also Moses is going to be presenting or giving some information about them. So Caleb Langworthy will be doing that. Our presenters are Dantoin and Ying Vang. And Caleb will be telling about them as well, giving some of their bios. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Caleb.
Hey, thanks for joining us for the last webinar in our 2019 Summer Organic webinar series, done in partnership with Wisconsin Land and Water, NRCS, and Moses, who I work for, the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service. Today we are presenting working with small organic farms with Valerie Dantoin. Valerie has a master's degree in agronomy from UW-Madison, but she really got her education by milking grazing cows with her husband, Rick Adamski, for 25 years on the farm that's been in the family for 120 years. Their mission at Full Circle Farm is to model ecological, sustainable farming that values people, the land, and good economic returns. Valerie developed and teaches a suite of 25 accredited courses at Northeast Wisconsin Technical College in Green Bay in the Sustainable Food and Ag Systems Associate Degree Program. The second presenter today will be Ying Vang with NRCS. He has worked as a soil conservationist with them for 13 years. He graduated from UW-Stevens Point with a bachelor's in science and wildlife management. And his folks have a small vegetable farm in Marathon County, Wisconsin. So we'll let Val take the reins here and start our webinar.
My contact info here, and I'm going to be talking about what I call slow farms or sustainable, local, mostly organic farms, and our management systems and how they relate to NRCS programming and practices, and what I know of are some examples of how people are interfacing and using those programs. I have three examples. The first one is Andy. He returned to his family farm near Green Bay. He's a young and beginning farmer. He actually has a bachelor's degree in finance from UW-Milwaukee, and he decided an office job wasn't for him. So he wanted to come back and start milking cows. So he built a coverall barn, put in a robotic milker. He's got 200 acres and 65 cows with, as you can see here, a transponder chip on their collar, and those cows find their way back to the robot and get milked on average of twice a day. He ships his milk to Organic Valley currently, and he uses managed grazing from May to November. He does not use any herbicides, pesticides, or GMO seeds, and he has very high organic matter, great soil health, good crop rotations that all help keep the weeds down. So what programs does he use? Andy used EQUIP to get started with fencing, pasture establishment, and cover cropping. And he also used Beginning Farmer Loan to build that coverall barn. And he has a typical TMR mixer. He's got new young stock housing. But as a finance major, he's balanced his budget so he knows what he can afford, what he's making off the cows coming off pasture, and what his loans are. And he really would not have been able to get started without this loan. So that was super important for him, as it is for a lot of young people. But also these practices helped him get going. Example number two, Heather and Andrew. They are on a highly diversified farm. They're relatively high-tech people compared to me, the older generation. So instead of asking me, so I am Andrew's mom, they ask Google for a lot of advice, which is a little bit irritating. But they're very innovative. For instance, they wanted to try rabbits on pasture. They do a lot more than that, but that's an example of innovation. They're pretty idealistic, and they're very passionate. They're really poor, so their operation is cash flowing right now, but they're still not paying themselves a salary. They both have off-farm jobs, and that's really typical too. And that's actually what I advise my students, to plan on having an off-farm job for at least 3 to 5 years while you're building your business. So they return to our family farm. They both have master's degrees in biology, so they're pretty smart people. And our farm is 240 acres. We're mostly grazing beef right now. This, I wanted to show a nice picture of the kind of finish we can get on our beef pasture. And Andrew and Heather are taking that beef to local farmers markets and direct marketing it. Here's some of the pricing that I wanted to show. The other innovative thing they're doing is a CSA, but with a meat box instead. That's part of actually our Slow Farmers Cooperative, where people can have a small monthly box of meat delivered to them or they pick up, and that's been a nice outlet as well. So they are also doing certified pork. This is a nice picture of Andrew out with his piglets, and you can see the kind of fencing. The pigs really respect that fencing in the background here. They're very trainable, and they do rut pasture if you leave them on a piece for too long. Andrew and Heather are, mostly Heather, are doing chickens on pasture as well. So they've got somewhere between 200, I think it's closer to 300 laying hens, and these follow our cattle on pasture, and they are selling their eggs to a successful professional football team near our farm that I'm really not supposed to say the name of because they have licensing agreements. But that team is eating about 150 to 200 dozen eggs a week. And again, our cooperative supplies those eggs because we can't do it all just from this farm. But this is an example of the nest boxes that stick out the back of this kind of a trailer, and clean, beautiful eggs come out that are highly desirable. Andrew and Heather also have a commercial vegetable operation right now. This is the core of the farm that as they're diversifying away from beef. And I should mention that we had been a dairy farm up until 2014. So 5 years ago, we sold the cattle. We thought we were retiring from farming, and lo and behold, our son and his partner came back. So this is just a corner of their farm, and this shed in the background is being converted from an equipment shed to this. It's going to be a packing shed. So this is an entire quadrant of that building. This is the styrofoam sheeting that's going in the back area for cooling and refrigeration unit for vegetables. And the rest of the area, there'll be walls around it. It'll be a wash and pack area that's very food safe. They have a food safety plan. That will be one of their advantages over other farms that don't take that extra step. And they are selling their vegetables also at farmers markets through a CSA, direct market to a few local restaurants, and that sports team as well. And they used microloan to get this project going. I myself have a question because they gave a $12,000 check to the contractor who's building this space for them, and I don't really understand how microloans work, and that check went directly to the contractor instead of to them, but that's fine. They're using EQUIP also for high tunnels. This is one high tunnel that's complete in the background. Here's a second one. The framework is going up. Those high tunnels are going to be somewhat larger and more expensive than the ones that Kyle will show in his presentation coming up. The end walls are polycarbonate, but part of what this farm wants to do is be a showcase farm for visitors and customers alike. So that's why they went polycarbonate on the end. This is not a high tunnel. This is a propagation house. It is hooked up to a propane tank, so there's heat in here. So this is not a cost shareable practice. This is the kind of practices they use. The tillage for the garden area is usually about 7 to 8 acres. Most vegetable operations only will do 9 to 10 acres maximum if they're organic. Of course, there are larger vegetable organizations or operations, I should say, and they are usually not direct marketing. If you're direct marketing, it's usually under 10 acres, but the profit per acre is pretty substantial. It can be in the tens of thousands per acre depending on the crop. So we use our regular farm equipment to do the tillage on the farm. It's a nice advantage of having a farm in transition, a joint farm. Then they pull a seeder, this is a 6-row seeder, behind a similar tractor, and this is how they plant most of their vegetables in beds, and they can, you know, take out any number of the seed boxes, so they're only planting 3 rows if that's what they want to do. And then here comes a basket weeder, and that is the way to control weeds in an organic system. And this is just pretty typical. A lot of small equipment like this. And NRCS does not have a lot of programming, I think, around small farm tillage, because it really isn't much of a resource concern, because it's usually bordered by quite wide buffers, and also it just doesn't impact as many acres. So that's something I wish we could change a little bit. The field crop practices on this farm there's 5 acres of dry edible beans for humans. There's grain sorghum, about 10 acres that will be harvested for the pigs for winter feed. Same for buckwheat, 10 acres. There was triticale already harvested for the pigs as well. And there's sorghum Sudan grass that was put up as baleage for winter feed for the cattle on about 20 acres. So you can see there's a good chunk of land that is tilled, and it's mainly going for animal feed, not dairy quality animal feed, but still it's something that we know that after the grain comes off, we are planning to put cover crops on it, and there's no NRCS payment to us for that. It's just something we would do sort of normally because we're organic farmers. And also, we just didn't have our sequence down yet this year. It's a little bit last minute what we decided to do, so we didn't apply for cover cropping practice or anything like that. Maybe in future years when we have a better pattern. Here's a third example of a farm. This is Claire Hintz. She has a permaculture farm up in Bayfield County. This is her driveway, and her farm is called Elsewhere Farm. This is her home. She's got a greenhouse basically attached to the front, which faces south. And this is her front yard. I'll show you another picture of it later. And that's a picture of Claire. Here's her farmhouse a little bit more close up. She's got all kinds of edible berries and pollinator habitat in here. And that's really what permaculture is. It's using permanent agriculture. So she's never going to till these fields. And it's still getting food and crop off of non-tilled acres. So that's something I hope NRCS can investigate further. If you stood right here and turned around the other way, you would see this. It's a wetland in Claire's front yard, but it serves another purpose. It's a heat sink. So in the warm days, the little pond that's underneath all these cattails will absorb heat and water. This is actually a lot of rocks around the rim, and that will also absorb heat, and then it slowly releases the heat to the plants around the pond so that her season is extended up there in Bayfield County. And this is just another example of her kind of farming. These are her fields. She's got a high deer fence because of the deer population up there. And to most of us, the fields look pretty weedy, but really this is not something that she views as weeds. This is just covered permanent agricultural crops. She does have some annual vegetables in here, but it's mostly orchard, which is why this is covered by a high fence. Sustainable organic farming does not allow for GMO crops, herbicides, pesticides, continuous corn, or corn and soybean in a continuous rotation. This is what our neighbor does. He's had corn or soy on the same field for, it's going on 25 years now. No rest in between with a break for a hay crop. We can't use antibiotics or hormones in the animals, and just so you know, most small and startup farms would not have a manure pit, so they would not be interfacing with NRCS with that. What organic farms do require in their land management is properly composted manures. So this is our windrow of manure bedded pack from a previous winter. It's laid out here This happens to be finished compost. It's turned, and there are restrictions on how to manage that in organic. So whenever you see this 205 code, that's the organic program's rules in the USDA. Well, actually, I'm not sure, in the Federal Register somewhere. But we have to manage that compost so that we improve organic matter, we don't contaminate crops, soil, or water, we don't add pathogenic organisms, heavy metals, or residues. That's how we're supposed to manage. And also we have to maintain 131 degrees for 15 days in a windrow like this, and have turned that compost at least 5 times. Here's a good tip sheet if you're working with any small organic farmers who want to know more about composting. This is a nice tight tip sheet. It's from ATRA, which is a good organization. The other thing that sustainable organic farming does require is buffer strips, usually about 30 feet wide. So here's my neighbor's tilled field. This is one that's been continuous corn and soy forever. Here's our 30-foot wide buffer strip, and then over here is pasture. So we have to keep this intact so we don't get any contamination. We are required to do crop rotations, although if we leave something in pasture for 5 years, which is our typical rotation, that, you know, we don't rotate things every year. We don't till up every year. Our typical rotation is 5 years of pasture, 1 year into corn or a grain crop, then right back down into pasture after that. That helps us control our annual weeds in the corn. We also use a lot of green manures, cover cropping. Managed grazing is a requirement, and animals must have access to pasture. And we do have to have a soil health care plan, water quality plan around riparian areas as well. So all these practices that organic farms do typically reduce weeds, pesticides, and runoff. And that's obviously a good thing, and water contamination. Our farm happens to be a zero phosphorus runoff farm because we have living roots in the ground all year round. Many of you know the benefits of managed grazing and perennial pasture. And we have a discovery farm monitoring well on our farm, and we have almost non-detectable levels of phosphorus, so not a resource concern. For the first time this year, we're enrolling in CSP. We have a pond similar to this. This is not our pond. And we're already doing most of the practices, or we're very close to completing the practices. And we are using riparian corridors, tree plantings, pollinator habitat, and wildlife corridors. And I think we have, I want to say something like 6 acres that'll go into CSP this year. And this is kind of a take-home message. I think most NRCS land water conservation people don't realize is that organic standards themselves are really soil and water conservation plans. So I'm going to show you an example of an organic standard plan. This is section 5 of the plan, and it has to do with soil and crop fertility management. Here's the National Organic Program rule that's cited. And it starts out by asking some general information. What are your soil types? What are your deficiencies? How do you monitor your effectiveness? So organic farms are required to monitor and test for nutrients so that we're not putting on excesses. This is straight out of a organic certification paperwork. It's conservation, really. What soil conservation practices are you using on your farm? And you get to check any of these check boxes that you are using. So in our example for our farm, we're using riparian management, we're maintaining wildlife habitat, we're actually using contour farming in some places, we're undersowing, we're using winter cover crops, and so forth. And then you could write anything else you're doing as well. What soil problems do you experience? You have to list those out and what you're doing about it also, and how you're monitoring your soil conservation, and then how often do you conduct soil conservation monitoring. Here's another part of the section 5 on organic soils and fertility, we have to discuss our natural resources. And mostly, I won't read this whole thing to you, but here's the rule. And then we have to manage for biodiversity on our farm as part of our organic certification. And we have to include, or we should list on our maps, hedgerows, woodlands, wetlands, etc. List our native plants. We should list our invasives as well, and how we're going to take care of conservation. And then there's a whole diversity questions we can answer. For example, here's one: what actions do you take to provide habitat for pollinators, predators, bats, and birds? And you just can check boxes if you want, or you can write in longhand or type it in if you're doing this online. But here's the types of questions that are asked in the organic certification farm plan. So just to conclude, I think small farms are using NRCS programs. We're already doing so many good things for soil and water conservation when we participate in our organic certification, that it's really easy to take the next step and just do the paperwork with a conservation office. And we're mostly using EQUIP practices. I think if you wanted to try and talk to organic farmers, you could get many of them to look at CSP as well, because it's a pretty easy step to that. So with that, I guess I'll take questions if there are any.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or you can send it through the chat line. I'm not hearing any, so Ka, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Kayla for inviting me to put this presentation together. I know with organic systems, there's quite a bit of challenges that small farms or organic farms tend to be smaller, but there's a lot of challenges that systems face. So as NRCS, what can we do to alleviate or solve some of those challenges? So I'm going to go through a couple of things. So I'm going to go through challenges with equipment. You know, equipment could be something that's quite challenging for small farms getting the money to do it. I know Val kind of talked to that with Andy on some of those equipments that are quite costly to invest in, whether it's a rototiller, harvester, a sprayer, cold storage, things like that. Another thing too is regulation. Val touch up on that too. There's a lot of regulations within NRCS or with the organic that you have to follow, and how can NRCS help and alleviate some of those regulations or help with those regulations in terms of cost sharing. Land is another one too that's quite challenging to find if you're looking for organic land, being in there for at least 2 years to get it certified. Challenges of getting those, land nowadays are quite expensive as well. So how can not just NRCS, but USDA as a whole? Management costs. It also talks about pests and disease control. Another one is just water management. How can NRCS come up with different practices that can help with some of those challenges? Competition with larger industrial farm. Organic, when you go to a grocery store, you see a bottle of milk that's organic, and then could be from a larger industrial organic farm, or it could be from a small dairy farm. Which one would you don't know that, but how do you compete with some of those bigger ones? Soil amendments, looking at not being able to use a lot of the commercial fertilizers that's out there. How can small organic farms be able to amend the soils to make your crops productive? The other thing is non-productive land. These are like your sandy knolls, the hillsides, the grassy hillsides, your woodlots. Those are non-productive land that kind of sit there as kind of like a wasteland. And how can, those are challenges that small farms had to face. You're paying taxes on it, but you're not getting any incomes off of those non-productive land. How can we, NRCS make those productive? And Val touched up on that too, that, a lot of those small farms are really poor. I mean, as far as getting the cash flow, you almost have to take a full-time job outside while you also farm at these organic scale small farms as well. So how can NRCS kind of help with that cash flow as well? And I'm going to go through a few programs. Many of you are very familiar with the programs. We'll touch up on the EQUIP program, or Environmental Quality Incentive Program through NRCS. This is probably like the meat and potatoes of NRCS when it comes to the workload with NRCS. So I'm going to go through just a little few slides pretty fast on what EQUIP is. So EQUIP, basically, it's a voluntary program. Anybody could apply on there if they have financial interest in agriculture. On that, financial offers, or through EQUIP, we offer like financial or cost sharing for practices such as structural practices, which I'll touch up on some of the examples later on in the presentations. Basically, once you put in an application, the application gets ranked based on the resource concerns that your objective is for the application. And then typically the contract runs from 1 to 10 years, but I would say probably 70% of those contracts are usually 1 and 3 years to get it implemented. How do you qualify? You just have to be an agriculture producer who engage in livestock production or own land that is in those land uses, whether it's agriculture, non-industrial private forest land, or other land that produce other agricultural products. You have to have control of the land for the life of that contract, be in compliance with the Farm Bill provisions, and also make less than $900,000 per year as the payment limitation or adjusted gross income requirement. And then the most important part is you have to have a resource concern. So with EQUIP is basically you come out, take a look at what kind of concerns do you have, and is there practices within EQUIP that we can use cost sharing to help you address those concerns. So EQUIP is a problem solving kind of a program where there's a problem, we use cost share to resolve that issue that's out on the land. And then we can jump into CSP. CSP is a little bit different program than EQUIP. Some of the program rules are kind of similar. It's also a voluntary program that you can be in. Land that are required to put in, or land that you operate. So all the land that you operate has to be in the contract, unless you can't get control of it, such as lease, things like that. I'm just going to browse through CSP. I'll talk about CSP in a little bit later on, as far as using it as a way to overcome some of the challenges, such as cash flow later on. But looking at, going back to some of the challenges, equipment, and we talk about, Walt talks about that with Andy, being able to use some of the programs through USDA, not just NRCS. And with small farms, whether you're, like I said, getting a rotor tractor or a roller tiller or a tractor, it's quite expensive. So through FSA, the microloan is an option that farmers can use to get funds to buy this equipment. I help a couple of landowners to go through the microloans to maybe get a well, get a well on their property for irrigation purposes. Getting a high tunnel, but they have to use the fund first, and getting a loan to buy the high tunnel before NRCS reimburse them at a later date once the high tunnel is completed. Things like that. Microloans are very valuable for I would say, for a lot of small farms, especially organic small farms. And NRCS does have cost sharing for equipment such as fence, water line, watering tanks, well for livestock and other structural practices through the EQUIP program as well to get some of these equipment. So challenges with some of those equipment could be overcome with some of NRCS's cost sharing. And then talk about regulation. Now, with regulation through organic, there's quite a bit of regulations. Caleb gave me a booklet, with all the regulations, not all the regulation, but part of the regulation. It's quite thick. So how can NRCS be able to help with some of that? And Val talks about one of them as creating biodiversity on the land is a requirement through the organic system. So NRCS could help with creating that biodiversity, such as tree planting, conservation cover, putting in a pollinator habitat, things like that out on the land. Not only that, the regulation could be quite cumbersome. So NRCS has the organic initiative where landowner who wanted to transition to organic will need a path to follow by. So having a organic transition plan through NRCS could be like a roadmap for a lot of those small farms to follow and get them to get certified, and how to get certified, what to look for, the kind of record keepings that they needed to do. And again, talks about land, how land are expensive, and through FSA, the Farm Service Agency, and RD does have a lot of programs or loans available to help small farms acquire land for purposes of production through organic. And management costs is another thing that Ralph talks about too, is pests, pests and weeds. Organic system had always have a bad reputation for tillage, and not all of them, but I would say there are some organic systems that rely a lot on tillage for weed control. And how can NRCS help with that? Some of the practices to control weeds is mulching. NRCS doesn't have a cost sharing for mulch for the purposes of weed control on a crop production system. But NRCS does have a cover crop practice, and we could use that indirectly, creating mulch, using the cover crops such as, let's say, cereal rye, get it planted, and then come spring, rolling it, and then no-tilling into that, the cover crop becomes your mulch. So in a way, NRCS, you can think of as indirectly cost sharing the mulch that will be for the weed protection for that particular crop. The photo on the left is actually one of my parents' farm. They have a tough time fighting pigweed and lamb's quarter. So what they did is through a program, CSP, is they planted peas, just a straight pea. They did throw a couple of cowpeas into it, but basically it's just forage pea or winter peas that they put out there, and it grows like a solid mat. Basically, any lamb's quarter and pigweed gets choked out. They planted pretty thick in there, probably close to 100 pounds to the acre of peas in that area, and not a single weed is able to grow through that mat of peas. Basically, what they do is they mow that off, and then transplanted peppers, eggplants, or other transplants into that, and the amount of weeds they get for the whole entire summer is probably reduced by almost 70%, just by having that mat out there to get rid of that first flush of weeds. And with pest too, NRCS does have pest management, and through the organic system, I haven't had any experience with a pest management through organic system, but we do have other practices that inadvertently helps with pest management, and that's through, let's say, conservation cover that attracts predatory insects. In that case, you're helping the vegetable crops by attracting pests, pest-eating insects, such as a lot of wasps. Potentially could help with controlling pests in that, and still abide by the organic standard. Management costs for irrigation. I know there's quite a challenge. There are some areas that you have to irrigate in order to get a decent crop. You know, unfortunately, like where I am, it's all sand, and you need to irrigate just to get a crop out of that. NRCS does have a cost sharing for irrigation as well, although it does need a little bit more work on some of the smaller irrigation, micro irrigation. But the potential is there, and NRCS is continuing to work to get that micro irrigation to the point where small farms could use it without a lot of cumbersome details within that. And this is one that NRCS had I cannot think of anything to help with, is that competition with larger farms. Having your product being out there competitive enough, you know, that falls back on a lot of the producers being able to get out there to the customer. That NRCS, I don't think there's any practices or things that NRCS could do to help with that particular challenge. And if anybody out there who knows that or could use some indirect help from NRCS to get that, you know, please feel free to share your thoughts. Yes, with I saw that that question on there with pest management cover crop. Is there concerns of evidence for nutrient competition? And this is dealing with what is your coming crop. You know, knowing what your crop is going to be that next year, picking the right cover crop is pretty essential. The following year, you know, you may want to pick a cover crop that doesn't compete with that nutrients. So not picking, you know, rye, winter wheat, or that to compete with that the same nutrients competition for your crop the following year. So for example, you know, like, well, for my parents, what they are planting is they wanted nitrogen. So peas then is the way to go, is to limit the amount of or just don't use any, you know, commercial fertilizer for N. They use peas and use that as nitrogen for that particular crop. So knowing your crop and then knowing the cover crop, you can pick one that would not be a competition or potential nutrient scavenger for away from your crops. Soil amendments. This is good tied to that as well. Soil amendments, it's something that organic farm has quite a bit of challenge with, not being able to use a lot of the synthetic fertilizer or commercial fertilizer. So how can we, NRCS, help with adding that in? And again, you know, using that legume cover crop, you can then add in that nitrogen that you don't. Oh, for my parents, you know, that peas probably gives them close to 75 to 100 units of N per acre, and that they don't have to use, and that's more than enough for the crops that they're growing out there on those land. And through CSP as well, maybe a lot of the smaller farms, we don't have the capability or go through a real depth soil test on our soils, and it does cost quite a bit too to get those in-depth soil tests. And through programs like the Conservation Stewardship Program, they can pick enhancement that would actually help cost share some of those bigger or more detailed soil tests, such as like the Haney test, to look at what is the health of that soil over that 5-year period that you're in the contract, and then give you some suggestions on how can you improve that soil health on that crop. Another challenge with small farms is, or not just small farms, all farms, we have these non-productive area, and these are, some farmers look at these and say it as, think of it as wasteland. It's basically sitting there, you're paying taxes, and you're not getting anything off all those non-productive area. These are like your woodlots, your hillsides, the wetlands, or areas that are really low yielding plots or areas that are, you just don't get a whole lot of yields out of there. How can our NRCS help with some of these areas? NRCS, our mission is basic to help people help the land. But even if we do that and we help people help the land, but the producer is not making any money or not actually, breaking even, then we likely will lose those producers. So these areas are areas that are potentially helpful to generate incomes off of these areas. Your woodlots, those NRCS does have practices such as the conservation activity or the forest conservation activity program or activity plans that they can apply for, where they could hire a private forester to come into their woodlots and evaluate, hey, what are the are there concerns within this woodlot? What do I have out there? And if there are concerns, what can we do to address those concerns? Whether the landowner's objective could be for wildlife or it could be for timber production. How can NRCS come in with forestry practices that would help better that woodlot? Other practices through CSP that some of our applicant or contract have done is they use that woodlot to generate another crop, doing mushrooms, doing mushroom logs within the woods, and now that woodlot becomes generating income generating piece of land instead of just being a wasteland. Some of the rural sandy knolls or your hillsides, instead of having it sit in that grass or monoculture grass, or let's say brome, NRCS could come in and improve that through conservation cover. And instead of having it non-productive, now even though it's not producing something, it's actually benefiting your vegetable. Now it's attracting beneficial insects. Not only that, it's attracting pollinators that helps with your vegetable production. In areas that are wetlands, NRCS or in working conjunction with FSA does have programs like CRP to protect these wetlands, and you can set aside cropland that are adjacent to wetlands, streams, areas that, like I said, on their low yielding areas, can be set aside and then get a yearly rental rate on those land for, let's say, 10 or 15 years. Those areas may not even doesn't even break even on your inputs that you put in there. You're not even breaking even to recover all those costs. So if you put it into some of these programs, you're not inputting anything, but yet you're getting an income off of these low yielding area. And some of these could be like along your wood edge as well. You know, everybody see wood edge where there's basically all eaten up by deer, or it gets shaded out and you just don't get that yield. You know, putting those into like a field border, not only does it help your bottom line with revenue, but it also helps the rest of the farm out. Another thing is, you know, Val talks about the challenges of cash flow. Once you implement some of these practices or apply for these practices to EQUIP, you have to use funds up front to implement it before EQUIP could reimburse or pay you that the rate for that practices. So how do you come up with that cash in the beginning to get these practices completed before you get reimbursed? Well, for this year, there has been a big push for historical underserved group. These are your beginner farmers, limited resource farmer, socially disadvantaged farmer. These are your other ethnic background farmers, your veteran farmers. These farmers could actually request up to 50% of the contracted amount up front. And this is where the cash flow can come in, is now you get 50% of the obligation amount to implement those practices before you get the other, once you completed those practices, then you get the other 50%. So this year has been a big push for, you know, like I said, historical underserved group to get them that cash flow, help them with that cash flow with the 50% upfront. CSP, the payment for that is usually comes in the fall of each year. So planning it out, practices that are for that year could be planned out ahead of time, where you can get that payment in the fall before you complete that practice and in the spring. So having it, you know, work with your NRCS personnel, or as NRCS, you know, work with your producer to make sure that there is cash flow to complete those practices. The other option is contribution agreement with a lot of these small farms too. Work with like your LCD, work with some of the organizations and create contribution agreement. This is probably the most flexible most flexible program that we have, as providing an objective, you know, with that group, and the NRCS could provide this contribution agreement, or this almost like a grant to that particular group to achieve your goal. And this one has been overlooked by a lot of our farmers, a lot of our NRCS personnel as well, as to work with partners to get contribution agreement that potentially could go beyond some of the programs that we offer. And for this one, I'm gonna, you know, talk a little bit more about CSP and how CSP is a little bit more advantageous to small farms. Many of the practices in EQUIP talks about, you know, let's say cover crop at cost share rate of about $50 per acre. On a small farm, it's not really worth it to come in and apply for cover crop on 2 acres, go through all the paperwork to get $100 worth of acre of contracts. But through CSP, it may be worth it because, you know, minimum payment for CSP is $1,500 per year. So even if the landowner has 2 acres of vegetables, it's well worth their time to come in and get that, apply for CSP. And even if they get the minimum $1,500 per acre, they can use that towards cover crop and some other, you know, other expenses in improving that cropland. And CSP has been a stepping stone to many other practices in our offices. You know, getting landowners to come in to get them to CSP and getting that fund out there to them, they're able to open up and do a lot more conservation practices on that land without NRCS's cost sharing, because now they have the funds to do so. So that's one thing that, you know, I'm a big proponent of CSP for a lot of the smaller farmers. I know the way our agency is, you know, we get a lot of our goals and things like that are based off of acres. And as small farms, you know, you may be having 5-acre farms. That 5-acre farms could be generating revenues as much as a 200-acre cash crop farm as well. So think of it as that way, and those two are very comparable in terms of cash flow or revenue per farm. And we should, you know, not look at acres for just for goal purposes. One of the things that I think is very beneficial to a lot of the small farms is seasonal high tunnels. Val talks about that too. Is this is just I'm just gonna put, you know, all the criteria up there for you to look at. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's something that small farms could increase their revenue by being able to grow crops a little bit earlier, and then able to harvest them a little later into the season. With a few changes with the seasonal high tunnel, now you could actually put heat in the high tunnel. The only requirement is that the crop has to be grown directly on the ground. So you can grow year round in there if you have heat in the high tunnel. And that requirement of having heat in the high tunnel, that was taken off a couple of years ago. But now that door is open to be able to grow year round in the high tunnel with providing heat, fan, electricity, things like that in the high tunnel. Like I said, it's just the requirement is as long as you grow your crops right on the ground, you're good. So with that, I'll kind of end it to see if anybody have any questions. Okay, are there soil testing lab that works specifically with organic? I don't know if there's any. I know that UW system, they do have soil tests for vegetable crops. So as you fill out the forms of that, making sure you check the appropriate boxes for what your purpose is for that land, the soil test will come back for those recommendations for vegetables. I don't know if Caleb or anybody else online that could answer that a little bit better than I can.
I don't know of any labs that are working exclusively with organics. I do know that there exist a number of agronomists and crop advisors in the Midwest that work primarily with organic farms and transitioning.
Are there any other questions related to, NRCS programs?
Any questions? Otherwise, thank you everyone for attending and for presenting, and have a great day.